Hi, everybody. My name is Nanika Edwards. I'm a poet, author, artist, and many other things from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. And I'm continuing my series, my video series on critical thinking. It's centered around the story of David and Goliath on different levels. And if you missed my last video, that one, number 4, was about David. Number 5, this video, video 5, we're going to be looking at how Goliath thought. In video 4, I looked at how David thought. And in video 4, we saw that David was a giant of a thinker. so, let's get into it. Let's get right into it. We're going to learn from Goliath how not to think. How not to think. So let's see how Goliath thought. First of all, he was arrogant. And as we know, and this is just conventional wisdom, pride comes before a fall. And Goliath had lived long enough. People had been around long enough to have discovered that universal truth. So Goliath was arrogant, right? He was extremely arrogant. And that should have been a personal red flag for him, but it wasn't. Um, Number 2, Goliath didn't test his assumptions. For example, and he had many assumptions here, right? But one of them was he assumed that he was going to be engaging with somebody in hand to hand combat. And he knew that once that was the case, it was a done deal. He was going to win. He was going to whoop their butt. He was going to beat them to a pulp. So he did not test his assumptions, I think, because, he liked the idea of winning. What better way to win than hand to hand combat? So he didn't test his assumptions. And so if we're to become good critical thinkers, we need to test our assumptions. Don't assume that you're right about everything. And with respect to arrogance, don't think that you're right about everything. Don't be convinced that you're right about everything or even that you're better than everybody else, right? That's a surefire way to fall flat on your face the way Goliath did. So, one, we don't want to be arrogant, and two, we want to test our assumptions. Number 3, Goliath was thinking with his giant spleen. The spleen is an organ that's traditionally connected, that's traditionally metaphorically connected with our emotions. But I think it might not just, it's kind of metaphysical maybe, but maybe it's also physical. I'm not too sure. But the spleen is an organ, a physical organ that we connect with emotion. So what I'm basically saying is Goliath was thinking with his feelings and not with his brain. And a lot of people do that. A lot of people think with their feelings and not with their brain. But we have to think with both, but definitely, especially with our brain, okay? Or maybe half and half, but a lot of people think mainly with their feelings, and the Bible says that the heart is deceptive above all things. And where do our feelings come from? Our heart. So it's very unwise to be led primarily by our feelings. Anyway, by the way, at this hour of the morning, for some strange reason, people decide to drag race and drive around with loud engines. So if you hear any loud engines, please forgive me. I'm just gonna keep recording, right? So Goliath liked he was in love with the idea of coming out as the champion of the Philistines and winning the war by beating somebody much weaker than him, because most people would have been, right, physically weaker. And so the thought of that, the ideation of that, the feeling of pride and joy and happiness, elation, excitement, the thrill, all of those things that he got from that thought, he rode on that, right? And the thing is, it led to his demise. That's how dangerous not thinking critically can be. So, be careful. Don't just think primarily with your feelings, because if you do, you could land up in a real stew. You kind of have to we have to divorce ourselves from our feelings sometimes, and just try to be almost kind of clinically distant, clinically logical. So don't let your feelings rule you. You have to rule your feelings, and you also need to connect your feelings to your intellect. Are you hearing that car? You're hearing the music? All the windows where I am, all the windows in my house are closed, and you can hear that. That's crazy. That person is not thinking critically. They're thinking with their emotions. What they're thinking is, I want to listen to my loud music, so I go listen to my loud music. Me care who's sleeping, me care who in bed, me care who's sick. I playing my music at 4 in the morning. The only music we should be hearing right now is the birds singing in the garden, because they start singing at 4 in the morning, interestingly enough. I always know what time it is at 4 o'clock, because the birds start singing on the dot, almost on the dot. And it's a beautiful sound. But anyway, let me not go off tangent here. That car that just passed with that loud music is a good example of somebody thinking with their emotions, and their emotions leading them to idiocy, and not to thinking with any kind of emotional intelligence, which is a big part of critical thinking. Anyway, let me continue. We learn from Goliath that it's so important to gather info. Goliath didn't gather any info. It's interesting. David seemed to know about Goliath because he certainly knew that he had four brothers. I don't know if somebody told him, somebody in the camp. I don't know if when Goliath was, ranting and raving and taunting and mocking and all of those things. I don't know if in the middle of all of that, he let the other side know that he had four brothers, and maybe somebody in the army told David. I don't know. But somehow they knew about Goliath, and David knew that he had four brothers. But Goliath didn't know about David. And he didn't seem to know, it would seem to me. I'm not too sure, but I get the impression, especially from maybe one or two of the videos that I looked at, that in those times, slingshotters, people skilled with slings, were an important part of many armies. So people with slings, apparently they had deadly, accurate aim, and they could do some serious damage in the middle of a battle. So Goliath did not seem to gather in sufficient information, or else he would have factored in that there could have been other alternatives apart from hand to hand combat to decide this particular battle. So, with respect to critical thinking, it's important to gather info, like by reading, researching, talking to people, looking at videos, just being generally informed or specifically informed. It's important to gather info, because the more info we have, the better we can analyze things and come to conclusions about things and make decisions and problem solve and all of those things. Okay, what else do we learn from Goliath? His decision and his decisions were based on presumption. He assumed that his Philistine god was bigger and badder than the Israelite God, when history had proven, when you look at, the 10 plagues of Egypt, you look at the fall of Jericho, you look at all kinds of different things, and there was historical evidence to prove that Israel was not an opponent to take lightly. Okay, the other thing that we learn from Goliath is that it's important not to base our decisions on presumption. We have to be sensitive enough to how we think to know when we're being presumptuous. So Goliath took one look at David. He saw what he thought was a little boy with some nice pink cheeks, and he was a pretty boy in a sense. It's believed that David was a kind of pretty boy. He didn't, at least at that age, he was handsome, but in a pretty kind of way. You understand? Not that he wasn't masculine, but he was a pretty boy. So anyway, he looked at David. He saw a pretty boy. He see him carrying a staff. You know, and he's thinking, oh man, I'm gonna eat him for lunch, right? So he presumed that David wasn't prepared. It's almost like David was like a Trojan horse. You know the story of the Trojan horse and the fall of what was it? I think the fall of Troy, was it? The Trojans, not was it the fall of Troy? The Trojan horse was a gift that was sent to the city of Troy, I think it was, if I'm getting this right. If I'm getting it wrong, please feel free to correct me. But David was like a Trojan horse, because um, Goliath looked at him and decided, okay, he's harmless. But he didn't realize that there was a warrior inside of him, and he didn't realize that there was a giant bigger than Goliath inside of David, and it cost him his life. So we should not base our decisions on presumption. Now, of course, when we base our decisions on presumption, the liability may not necessarily be something as serious as what happened to Goliath, that where it cost him his life, but it will cost us something. It could cost us something. So it's important not to base our decisions on presumption. The other thing is that Goliath was suffering from cognitive bias. Cognitive bias is when we we don't question our assumptions. We take what we believe as fact. We take our feeling as fact, and we believe that the way we believe that the way we see things has to be the right way. That's cognitive bias, and it may seem, whatever we're thinking may seem logical to us, but that's what happens when we're ruled by our feelings. And the other thing we learn from Goliath is that dishonesty does not pay, and propaganda may not always have the payoff that we're looking for. So, you know, Goliath talked a lot of smack. He attacked the identity of the Israelites and the people of God, and he was wrong. He thought he was right. He thought what he was saying was accurate, but it was really, to be honest, the enemy, the devil, using Goliath to attack and undermine the identity of the people of God. The enemy was using Goliath to cause the people of God not to focus on the fact that they were the people of God. He told them that they were the slaves of Saul. He conditioned them over 40 days and 40 nights, right? He came out in front of them 40 days and 40 nights, taunting and teasing them. Over 40 days and 40 nights, he was able to condition them into thinking that they were slaves of Saul, not even just servants, but slaves of Saul. And he was kind of massaging them into getting comfortable, quote and unquote, with the idea of being slaves of the Philistines, right? So, but that was not how God saw them. So, from God's perspective, what Goliath was doing was essentially lying. So, if we're going to be good critical thinkers, we can't be dishonest. We have to be honest. And I guess one person's dishonesty is another person's honesty, and vice versa. But um, I'm pretty sure that Goliath knew that he was stretching the truth a little bit sometimes. So dishonesty cannot be a pillar of critical thinking. It has to be truth. Truth is a pillar. Truth is something on which things can stand. dishonesty is weak and it has no integrity, it has no strength, so it cannot stand. Just like Goliath didn't stand, he ended up falling on his face. The other thing we learn from Goliath is that we should not blindly follow our commander. Who was Goliath's commander? Yep, Satan. So Goliath followed whatever Satan whispered in his ears and put in his mouth and put in his heart. And he didn't think twice. It felt, like I said, he was thinking with his spleen, he was thinking with his feelings. He hated the people of God. So, whatever hateful things the devil whispered in his ears, that's what he was shouting at the army of God. So, Goliath didn't question his commander. And it's really important to question people in leadership. When we're talking about like just regular human life, it's important to question people in leadership in a respectful way. Do not abdicate your responsibility and your right to think for yourself. One place where people do this a lot, and now I'm speaking to Christians, is in church. A lot of people let their pastors think for them. And very often, the pulpits, church pulpits, attract narcissists. And narcissists love nothing better than to mind control people. You have to be so careful with that. Do not blindly follow your leaders. Don't be blind sheep. That's not what the Bible advocates, but unfortunately, that happens a lot in the church. We have to be thinkers. The Bible is a book that teaches us how to think. If anybody reads the Bible properly, especially if you have a relationship with Jesus Christ, you would clearly see that the Bible is designed to teach people how to think independently with God as our source of counsel and so on. So, you know, one thing we learned from Goliath, don't blindly follow your commander. Not saying don't follow your commander at all, but don't blindly follow your commander. What else do we learn from Goliath? He ignored historical data, right? So it's really important, like I was saying earlier in this series, I think in video 2 or 3, history is a great way, studying history is a great way to develop critical thinking skills. And if Goliath had studied his history, he would have remembered the 10 plagues of Egypt. He would have remembered the Tower of Babel. He would have remembered the fall of Jericho. He would have remembered many different things that would have pointed him in the direction of the fact that the God of Israel is indeed a living God and that what he was up against was something and someone formidable. But again, Goliath was thinking with his spleen and not with his brain, not with his intellect. So he ignored historical data at his own peril and to his own peril. So, how do we build critical thinking? By studying history, studying world history. Not necessarily just a specific geographic location, but world history and from different perspectives. That's very important. Okay, what else do we learn from Goliath? Goliath had zero creativity. He knew how to beat people with brute strength, and that was it. Yes, he had his javelin, he had his spear and his sword and all of that, but what he knew was one type of combat. Compare him to David. David knew how to, excuse me, how to beat lions and bears. David knew how to use a sling. David seemed to have been more diversely skilled as a fighter. And Goliath, where fighting was concerned, didn't really have much creativity. He certainly wasn't as creative as David, right? So one of the things we learn about critical thinking, it's important to be creative. What else do we learn from Goliath? It's important to be emotionally intelligent. Goliath was not emotionally intelligent. How do we know? One big way in which we know is by the fact that he was a bully. Bullies don't have any emotional intelligence. and with no emotional intelligence, and we don't manage our emotions, and our emotions manage us. Like Goliath was being swung back and forth, up and down, all around by his hatred. Right? He had no emotional intelligence, so it created this kind of thick smoke screen that he couldn't see past and he couldn't see through. And all he thought was, I hate these people, I want to get rid of them, blah, blah, blah. And, it prevented him from thinking straight. So it's important to have emotional intelligence. That's a key pillar of critical thinking. And finally, what else do we learn from Goliath? Goliath was powered, was driven by demonic wisdom. How do we know that he's connected to the demonic? Well, the Bible says he had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each hand. And he was a giant. He was of the lineage of the Nephilim, if I could put it like that. He was a Nephilim. The Bible talks about Nephilims in the Old Testament, I think probably starting from the book of Genesis, when we learn about the flood and why God sent the flood and so on. It was because of the Nephilim, this this line of giants, and they were produced by the abominable union of fallen angels who forced themselves on women who were human. So Goliath was a Nephilim. So we know that he was powered by demonic wisdom. The Bible says that demonic wisdom is sensual, earthly. It's not of God. It's a dark kind of wisdom. For example, in the Garden of Eden, Satan used his sly, cunning wisdom to bring about the fall of man. But it also led to additional punishment for Satan. And by contrast, the wisdom of God is shrewd, it's not cunning. There can be a difference between wisdom that is shrewd and wisdom that is cunning. In fact, the Bible says that to the pure, God shows himself pure, to the faithful, he shows himself faithful, but to the cunning, he shows himself shrewd. Being shrewd is a higher wisdom than being cunning. So when you pitted Goliath, or pit, is it pit or pitted? I'm not too sure. But when you when you pit Goliath against David, Goliath has demonic wisdom. David has godly wisdom. And when those two clash, the wisdom that is the wisdom of light, of God's glory, of true light, God's glory, versus a wisdom that is dark and devilish. Well, as we see in Genesis 1, the light was designed to govern the dark. Light was designed to govern the dark. So light will always win out against dark. So that's it. So in terms of critical thinking, in our times, in this age when human history is winding down, and we know that the time of the return of Christ is very near, according to biblical literature and biblical prophecies and so on, which are credible. I mean, if you want to look at the rate of the realization of these prophecies, I think you would find it convincing. You would find that they confirm the credibility of the Bible. So, because I mean, how do you thousands of years prior predict things that are going to happen thousands of years in the future without having some connection to an all knowing being, right? And people could argue however they want against that, but that's not good critical thinking. I don't know why people fight. Well, no, I know why people fight so much against those things, because by nature we're people are rebellious. We don't want to have to admit that there is a God that we have to follow and listen to, even though he's a loving God and what he asks us to do is perfectly reasonable. But People, we like to do our own thing. But anyway, in this age, one of the things people are fascinated by is witchcraft, the occult, and they see it as, giving them access to this spiritual wisdom that is, kind of, what is it, illicit and mysterious and, exciting. And that kind of wisdom is dark. And sometimes people literally use it. I've seen people, like young people especially, obviously influenced by witchcraft literature, and we know that that kind of literature has become very popular thanks to a certain book. I won't even bother to mention it. That's very popular. That really opened the door to the occult across the world, right? It definitely opened the world to the occult. Now, that kind of wisdom is dark. But a lot of people, whether they put it in these terms or not, see it as a resource for building critical thinking that can lead to critical power. But no, it's a dark kind of wisdom for which people will be judged. And it's something that God takes very seriously. And the Bible does actually provide glimpses into the spirit realm, but it does not want people dabbling in devilry, which is a dark kind of wisdom. So, let's go through what we've learned from Goliath and things to avoid. We need to avoid arrogance. We need to avoid assumptions that are not tested. We need to avoid thinking with our spleen as opposed to our brain. We need to gather info when we need to make decisions about things, or just so that we can be prepared to make decisions on the fly, as long as it's humanly possible to do that. We need to avoid decisions based on presumption. We need to avoid cognitive bias. We need to avoid propaganda and dishonesty. We need to steer clear of blindly following our leaders. Yes, leaders are there for a purpose, but remember that human leaders are people just like anybody else. They're not perfect. So, always hold them up to scrutiny, but respectfully so. And if you challenge them respectfully, depending on the circumstances, I guess. But don't be blind sheep. Whether you're a Christian or not, don't be a blind sheep. And we also need to sidestep ignoring historical data or ignoring history, not educating ourselves about history. I think history is a core subject that everybody should study. We need to avoid not being creative. The sad thing is that our educational systems around the world typically erase every trace of creativity that we would have had as children. So we need to recapture that and rekindle that, and it's totally possible to do that. The other thing we learned from Goliath is that we need to avoid a lack of emotional intelligence. We need to be emotionally intelligent. Most people are not emotionally intelligent. That's just a fact. And you say, how could you say that, Nika? I've had the opportunity. I am at the midway point in my life, and I've had the opportunity to observe a lot of people, and I look at a lot of YouTube videos, and I read a lot. And when I say read a lot, maybe not a lot of books, but I read up a lot on things online. I educate myself a lot via social media. I don't use social media mainly for entertainment. I mainly use it for education. And from what I have observed across a broad spectrum, is that emotional intelligence, generally speaking, is lacking. And remember, at the start of this series, I said that common sense is not common. Common sense is the bedrock of critical thinking. So, if typically speaking, you're not very emotionally intelligent, don't feel bad. You have a lot of company. I'm not trying to be insulting, I'm just stating the facts. So, it's really important to get in touch with your emotions, really important to understand what emotional intelligence is. Coming away from this video, you may want to go look up emotional intelligence, maybe even do some type of online test to see where you stand in terms of your own emotional intelligence, because very often people don't even realize that we're not emotionally intelligent. You know, you may think you're just fine when you might be very disconnected from your from any real kind of emotional intelligence. So, what do we learn from Goliath? It's important to be emotionally intelligent, and it's important to avoid not being emotionally intelligent, which, like I said, is not the norm. Most people do not have a high level of emotional intelligence. How do I know? Just look at the state of the world. People love to blame God. If God is a loving God, how could he do this and how could he do that? The problem is we are not loving people. That's a problem. God is a loving God, but we are not loving people. Why are we not loving people? Because we don't have emotional intelligence. We pop out of the womb, most of us, with emotional intelligence. But by the time we reach a certain age, it seems that we trade emotional intelligence and empathy and compassion and all of those things for narcissism. A lot of us, whether people want to see it or not, that's how I see it, and I don't think I'm wrong. So it's important to be emotionally intelligent. Look where not being emotionally intelligent landed the army of the Philistines. All right, so also we learned from Goliath that we really need to avoid demonic wisdom. You see, the occult, dabbling in things that are dark, trying to hex people, and all of these things, they will put you in a lot of hot water. I would not recommend it. I would not recommend it. You know, you can read about the story of, it's coming to mind now, the story of, I think it was Balaam. Was it Balaam or Balak? I forget. One of them was hired to curse the people of God, and you can read about that whole scenario if you're curious about, you know, the spirit realm and so on. That's a really good story to read, perfectly safe to read because it's in the Bible. It's wholesome. It's what God, it's permissible to read that, and you can get an idea of how these how this occult stuff works and what God may do in response to somebody dabbling in devilry. So that's it for this video. I hope that you enjoyed this. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. And I would encourage you to subscribe to my channel because there's lots more great content on the way. Until next time. By the way, something that I should add is that you can explore critical thinking through the account of David and Goliath from many different perspectives. There were different players, if I could put it like that, different actors, different people in that story. And all of them were thinking about that particular situation in a particular way. For example, you have Saul. How did he see the confrontation with the Philistines? How did he see David? How did he see himself? You have David's brothers, you have the Philistines, you know, the army of the Philistines, you know, excluding Goliath, whom we've already looked at. You have you have Abner, you have um, Jesse, David's father. You have different people, and then there are people who aren't mentioned that you could think of, you know, who would have been connected to that account and that historical event in one way or another. For example, the families of the soldiers on either side, the family of Saul, other nations looking on and knowing what's going on and kind of looking to see what's going to happen and how things are going to play out. So there are many different angles from which this whole conflict, this battle, this military confrontation, there are many angles, many perspectives from which it can be considered, keeping critical thinking in mind. And so you can ask yourself, all these different players, how were they thinking? What were they thinking to what extent were they thinking critically, and what kind of impact did that have on them personally or on the outcome of things. Coming out of my study of, my very intense and in-depth study of the story of David and Goliath, I have produced a book called David and Goliath 360-degree poetry. It's available on Amazon, and it's somewhat similar to my other book, David and Bathsheba 360-degree poetry, except that for David and Goliath 360-degree poetry, the poems are much shorter. It's a neater project in the sense that it's smaller, it's more compact, it's more concise. They're both great books. But if you would like to, have a bit of support, or a bit of extra content to help you think through the different perspectives from which you can analyze this encounter, if I could put it like that. Um, a, a few different angles from which you can analyze the ins and outs of what went down between David and Goliath, then I would definitely recommend this book. I will leave the link below the video.